Excellent. Well, today I'm here with Matthew Green and Daniel Garner, and we are going to be beginning the Resonant Man dialogues today. We're kicking it off. The initiative was launched just a few days ago. Super excited to bring this out, something that's been incubating and developing between Mathew and I. And this dialogue represents our opening of that to the world and beginning to really bring in the best philosophers and good fellows in this sense-making community to wrestle with the significance of this. And really from the outset, I think, Mathew and I would just stress that we're not viewing this as a one-off men's group. It's not really just a commercial initiative. We're viewing this as a call and a project of cultural transformation, and something which will be expressed through this initial container beginning in June, but really is something that we both feel has a broader significance. So welcome to you both. And maybe, Mathew, you can just begin by saying a little bit about how you found yourself called to the Resonant Man and what this all means. What's this all about? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Wow, it's amazing. We've been sitting with this for more than a year now, but to sum up what we're doing in a sentence is still something that is going to be impossible for me to do. I mean, it's a spirit that we're feeling. It's a call. It's an invocation. It's a sense that there is some way of being in the world that we can align with or embody, that in my understanding is a kind of evolutionary update. And what does that look like in practice? I think it's a lot in the field of relationality, how we relate to each other as men. And obviously in the practice space that we create, we'll have a lot of opportunity to work with transparent communication, with dialogos, and really explore how being in that environment can allow us to embody more of who we really are. But also, of course, it's taking that out of the space and relating more skillfully, more authentically, more openly with the people around us, obviously our loved ones. But I think we want to take this out into the communities, and we want to take it out into the world. It's time. We need it, but we need it to be showing up in the right way. And what that looks like, we don't have a prescription or an agenda, but we know that when we come together and allow that collective intelligence to start to materialize in our midst, then the unexpected starts to unfold.
That's a really wonderful opening, Mathew. I just want to reflect back and kind of hearing in that it's not about a particular role or a particular set of preferences or political viewpoints or what have you. It's something at the level of your way of being, your way of listening, your way of attending to what's around you. And of course, all of us are kind of the center of our own universe, as we put in the doc. We're each the center of the mandala. So if we can kind of bring a greater depth, if we can bring a greater quality of presence to whatever's around us, our family, our relationships, our work, then that's going to ripple outwards into the space. And so, Daniel, thank you so much also for joining us here. I mean, you and I have been dialoguing around a range of things, and I've been engaging with your book, Belonging Again, which is really a grand diagnosis of why we're in a state of kind of confusion and lostness in this time and all of the complexity involved in that. And you've also spoken on Parallax about masculinity directly and offered a really profound expression of that relating to masculinity as a kind of outflowing and as a participation. And I really felt that that vision that you painted, there was a similarity with the resonant man in the respect that it's not about a kind of a calcification and a rigid identity, and it's not a self-relating thing. It's kind of you in relation to world, you in relation to spirit, you really showing up for your environment. So yeah, welcome, and love to have your kind of opening remarks.
Well, delightful. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, gentlemen. And I always enjoy the opportunity to speak with you, Jacob and Mathew Green. It's a delight. And I enjoyed the Substack article, and I enjoyed the vision. I enjoyed the vision that was putting forth as masculinity as something that you give more than you define. Like if you're spending all day long saying, what is a man? Am I a man? You actually end up kind of falling into a bit of the problem of the definition. When you try to define a word, Derrida's like, well, it always defers to something else, right? And you actually become kind of pathological. And I think one of the things that has happened is we've spent so much time trying to define ourselves as Daniel and who we are, that we've actually not focused on the gifting of ourselves or the gifting of masculinity, which ironically means that we lose both. You know, C.S. Lewis has that wonderful line that I always like to quote, of the first things first principles, where he says, if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. And I think there's something that happens with masculinity like that. When you focus on the definition of what it is to be a man versus the practices and the way of life of giving masculinity or yourself or your Daniel to others, well, then you just find yourself with a kind of understanding of it. And maybe you can't even put it into words like a great work of art. Like many, if I were to ask you, what is Beethoven's Ninth? I know it when I hear it, right? I think you mentioned the word in the article, art. I think there's something about masculinity that is an art. I think femininity is an art. I think being a full human being is an art, that you know it when you do it. But then if somebody asks you, what is it? You're like that centipede in Nietzsche that then can't use it. Like the ladybugs ask the centipede, how do you use all that legs? All those legs. And the centipede goes, and then it dies, right? Knew how to do it until it was asked. And so I think for me, it's very important to kind of ask questions on, you know, if I were to think of my own story, I just, you know, found myself as a man, or I found myself in situations where people would ask me to help cut down trees, or I found myself in situations where I was being called on by the people around me. And then it was a question of how would I respond to that or not, right? And I also found myself with certain urges or desires or motivations that I didn't choose. I just found myself with them. And so that posed the question, do you deny them and oppose them, which seemed like repression, and that could lead to all sorts of troubles? But then if you just kind of carelessly express them, that also seemed to be a problem, right? So I was looking for this correct art by which to best handle these things you always already found yourself with. It's very similar to me, and then I'll pass it on. It's very similar to me as philosophy. I just found myself with ideas. I just found myself thinking. I didn't one day go, you know what, I'm going to have an idea today. I just found myself with ideas, which presented the question, what are you going to do? Are you going to work on those ideas or just absorb whatever ideas you have, right? Like you're going to have a philosophy. The question is simply, do you think about it or not? And if you don't think about it, it's probably going to become toxic, or it's probably going to be someone else's philosophy that you've absorbed and found yourself living without realizing it. I think the exact same thing happens with something like masculinity. If you do not think about it, you're still going to have a notion of what it is. It's probably just going to be problematic, probably not going to be a gift, and it might just be very, very confusing, right? So it's very important to think about it. But at the same time, because I think basically the society is, in some respects, there's almost a giving up on thinking these topics, because it's always going to be wrong, or it will lead to power, or will lead to definitions that keep other people out. Yeah, those are always risks. But if you don't think about it, then it just becomes pathological in the same way that ideas become pathological. You know, with postmodernism, some forms of postmodernism declaring an end to philosophy, it actually wasn't an end to philosophy. Now we just don't know how to turn it into an art form. Likewise, with identity and self, by not thinking about it, we don't know what to do with it. And so it becomes a burden that leads to all sorts of troubles. So the question is how to think of these subjects in a manner to which we are engaging in an outward vision, a giving vision, a gift vision. That is more the term, as you know, I like to use, is self-forgetful vision, a vision where we're not thinking about ourselves because we're in the flow of ourselves giving to the world, resonating a resonance, an aura, as opposed to thinking about me as a philosopher, me as a man, me as an individual. Because again, if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. So I think the question is, what would it mean to engage in a vision of masculinity that is outward focused, not inward focused, not thinking about what it means to you, but what it needs to be for others? And to get good at that art form. And you mentioned belonging again, which I appreciate you reading, and then I'll pass it on. Today is a world without givens. Anything is possible. Traditions are no more. There are all these things that have collapsed, which means we lack direction, to be very general with the argument, which means there's a lot of anxiety. This is quite a confusion's masterpiece, is the subtitle of the essay based on Macbeth. You're in an age of confusion's masterpiece. But in the midst of confusion's masterpiece, there is also the opportunity of a negation sublation into an art form that maybe has not been possible before, but that requires the work of thinking it, and that requires the work of doing it, and that will not be possible without initiatives such as this. So I'm glad that the initiative is being embarked on and engaged, and it is a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Mathew.
Wow. I'm still soaking that in. That's quite a hard statement to follow in one breath. But yeah, a few things really came through or me strongly. And one of them was this idea that we're not sitting around thinking or coming up with some idea about what it means to be a man, some kind of concept or some sort of mental construct. That's not the goal. It's more that, and again, I love this phrase, the work of art, bringing art into this, the art of relating. It's more that as we come into deeper relationship, as we perhaps find the kind of safety and trust and holding we need to release or start to release some of our habitual patternings, our habitual defenses, and remembering as well, and this is something I learned really quite powerfully in the last couple of years in the collective trauma work I've been doing with the facilitator Thomas Hubel. We had a very powerful men's group as a subset of that large group training. And I realized how many men actually feel very afraid of other men at some deep level. And I'm, for whatever reason, like, OG, you have ideas that arrive and emerge in probably great prodigality relative to many of us. I'm blessed with the fact that I actually don't have so much of that conditioning. I'm pretty comfortable in men's groups, and whether that's from school, for cultural reasons, from family, I'm not sure. But I really realized in that deep field of trust, we hit a layer of mistrust and suspicion of each other that we had to really honor and work through, and honor the intelligence of that reticence, of that holding back. And I think what I like about the fact that we've given ourselves more time with this course, we've given ourselves 8 weeks, or this it's not a course exactly, but this initiative, it gives us time to begin to liquefy some of that architecture and through relationship flow into new forms. And I think maybe, OG, I'm trying to say what you were saying, maybe less eloquently, but I'm pointing in a similar direction, that it's through relating that we find ourselves. We don't find ourselves by sort of thinking about ourselves. We find ourselves in relationship and having a space where we can relate differently, where we have different rules, and we have an honoring of the intelligence that can emerge between and through us when we commit to being together in that way. And I guess we could say more about what that actually looks like, but that's very much the principle that I feel coming alive in us as we do this work.
I think that's absolutely beautifully put. Yeah, I love this kind of distinction of, like, there's a way that we can be participating fully in the moment with one another, whilst also having let go of the mental constructs, the kind of rigid pathways, who I am, what this is, what this conversation is going to be about, where it's going to go. And this is ultimately, I think, what a lot of a lot of what gets rubbed up against between men and women also is that, you know, there are these kind of rigid, hard edges in our mental constructs and our identifications. And these are kind of connected with our emotional body and our emotional openness and expansiveness and those inherited patterns and so on. So there's a way in which we can be really in our purpose, really in our soul's calling, and also very liminal, very open in our kind of cerebral space. And that's a really optimal position. And that's sort of where that's kind of the place from which I feel the resonant man has come. And there's a deep cultural relevance to that, because we are in this position and we've tried to kind of bring some of that context into the resonant man. It definitely informs our sense that it's something needed now, is that masculinity is and has been under this kind of assault of deconstruction and challenge. And often the people engaged in the deconstruction are not themselves offering a positive vision. And it's not necessarily their responsibility to do that either. That's something that has to come from us and through us. And so Mathew and I kind of realized, you know, there's nowhere in culture right now for men to undergo a bit of a process of transformation, of potentially seeing what are those areas where I need to be challenged, where I need to undergo change, but in an environment that actually believes in your becoming as a man, that it's not kind of driven by trauma or driven by, like, you know, I've been hurt by men, so I need to kind of make sure that doesn't happen with you and kind of deconstruct your masculinity, but not offer that potent vision and that potential. And ultimately that needs to be drawn up from a really deep, soulful place in order to get the kind of masculinity that our time calls for, and not the more immature versions that have been cropping up in response to feminism and in response to the cultural climate and so on.
No, I love everything that everyone has said. And one of the things that I think about often is how reality appears where our ideas fail, but we need to have ideas to get to the place where they can fail. And one of the problems is we tend to use ideas to avoid points of failure, which means we exist basically in a simulation or a technical society where we're super smart, quote unquote, but actually it's the smart of disembodiment, right? Like, this is one of the great problems with philosophy, is philosophy tries to figure out how the world works in order to stay in the working, to never find the breaks. But you see, where you never find the breaks means you never find the reality. And I think there is something about masculinity that absolutely sours and falls apart if it does not rise to the occasions of the break. You know, I know Peter at Limburg at the Stoa has talked about themos. The great Owen has talked about themos, and themos is a Greek value, which is the notion of recognition, but it also has something to do with feeling like you rose to the occasion. And a lot of what Owen will talk about, and I love Owen, he wrote a wonderful book called Notes from the Pod about a lot of the issues in the world today. He does a lot on Paul Virilio, et cetera, so forth, is kind of themos. In the classical soul, you have the eros, you have the logos, but you also have the themos. And without the themos, which we can associate a bit with the warrior spirit, a bit with the rising to a challenge, a bit with the doing what the society needs, that you were able to step in and answer, but then did not, in doing that, feel like that made you better than other people, right? So there's this kind of humble servant thing that gets brought together, I think, especially when we start thinking themos with Jesus, but I'll pause on that. I think today, basically, the problem is we have a masculinity that is seeking something like themos, but doesn't know where to find it. They think you find it at the, say, in the corporate world, the technological world, or by, say, becoming or, say, reaching a place of superiority in the workplace or something like that, right? I would argue that masculinity has a lot more to do with no preset system or Let me put it this way. I think actually a big problem is a lot of masculinity is stuck in the professional managerial class, as in becoming managers, overlooking people, and then there's a power dynamic. Now, I'm not going to say that the professional managerial class has no role whatsoever. That's an entirely different topic. But you see, if that is what is associated with masculinity, I think that doesn't necessarily address the most. It actually leads to various pathologies and problems that are very problematic. I think actually the focus needs to be on, can you rise to the occasion of the unexpected when things don't go according to plan? You know, you mentioned the parallax course, which I love doing. And one of the things we talk about as a distinction with Ivan Illich is the difference between preparing and planning. And we live in a society today where everything is about planning. Do you have the best plan? Do you have a 5-year plan? Do you have a 10-year plan? And we tend to, and then masculinity gets associated with having the best plan that makes sure nothing goes wrong. But you see, the problem is that then enters into a power dynamic, because anyone who's against that plan, you either have to crush, exclude, or it becomes all problematic, right? Now, this isn't to say there's anything wrong with a plan. You're going to have to plan if you want to go to Kroger's this afternoon. There has to be some planning. But planning is actually a very small percentage of what you need in life. What you really need to do is be prepared for the unexpected, prepared for things you don't know are going to happen until they occur, right? I think masculinity has to be focused on preparing for the unplanned and the unexpected, because one, this naturally means that you need to like work and develop, but you also can't use that development towards something that fits into a plan that you know ahead of time, of which could lead to very hierarchical thinking or sort of crushing people in. But you're prepared for when the tree falls. You didn't plan for when the tree falls, but you're prepared for it. And now you can cut it up and remove it, and you know how to address the problem. We have a society basically where everything is about planning. Everything is about planning. And so a vision of masculinity that is more so focused on preparation, which I would argue is far more thematic. There is something very thematic about, wow, I was able to take care of that tree that fell. Wow, I saw a risk in an entrepreneurship that I had the bravery and the know-how to realize that I didn't know was going to be there, but I made it happen. There's something very satisfying about that. But here's the key. This satisfaction does not come from dominance over others. It comes from rising to the challenge of your own fears. It is rising to the challenge of you were ready to use a chainsaw and cut up the tree. You were ready to respond to the crisis, not because you're better than other people, but because you were ready for the unexpected. And I think that's also a vision that gets into how you can have this kind of competitiveness with yourself that is also for the society and for others, that also is getting at a vision where you need to be prepared for whatever life throws at you versus managing life to make sure everything is smooth and going according to plan. Because when you do that, it can become very flat. It can become very one-dimensional in a sort of Marcuse way. And then it can also lead to different pathologies and different things. So I think, and you know, also too, I should note on the feminine side, Aspasia and Adrian had a wonderful talk. I really like Aspasia on their talk, and Adrian Fondersi does wonderful work on this question. I think both, what you are seeing is generally kind of a notion that visions of the feminine and the masculine, and then I'll pass it on, really struggle to find identity in an over technocratic and over professional managerial world where everything is about running a system, running a technology, having the right ideas, being able to put the right variables into the program. Well, yeah, of course, both males and females feel like lost, because that's the world of a robot. That's the world of a machine in a kind of Nick Land sense. What we've done is we're running into a world where being the best means being the most machine-like, less natural, less nature, and we're trying to get back to what would it look like to get back to the concrete and to the actual. And I think it has a lot to do with preparing yourself for what arises in life that you don't know is going to be there ahead of time, but you're able to answer the call all the same. But let me pass it on.
Wow, I feel like you've just analyzed my entire career path or lack of. OG, like I feel like I'm now seeing my whole zigzag trajectory through institutions. through a new lens. And I guess there's many layers to respond to. One of the first ones that came up was when you talked about themos and themodic acts. I instantly had a recognition of a dilemma in my work, like today, that actually has been causing me pain. And I realized that it's because I didn't act thematically, if that's the word. I wasn't in the themos, right? I was holding back, and I didn't grasp this challenge really when I'm honest with myself. And fortunately, in this case, I've had a second chance, and actually another man has kind of prodded me to move, and that's been good for me. But when I bring it into that frame, it makes sense why it was troubling me. There was something about the situation that I couldn't identify that was gnawing at me. And I think that framing has given me a clarity about what was going on there. And I can look back at my earlier life and absolutely see that quest for themos. I was a war correspondent. I mean, I can hardly believe I'm saying that now, but I used to do that. I was with the Marines during the invasion of Iraq. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that proudly, but at the time, actually, I was pretty proud because I'd risen to a challenge. And we can have a whole nother conversation about the kind of the frames or the challenges we're offered, because I'd argue in retrospect that wasn't possibly the healthiest way of looking for themos, but it was a pretty traditional format that I was pursuing, right? And now actually thinking about it again, like that urge, that instinct is there. And it's not, as you say, it's not about having power over other people. It's about finding my place, I think, in what Thomas Hubel, who I'm studying with, would call a competence-based hierarchy, rather than the kind of technocratic power over structure that you just described, that I think we've all probably struggled to engage with or even stay employed by because it doesn't fit who we really are. And as we become more awake to who we really are, it's harder and harder to make those compromises. And so we have to find our own path. And that's challenging. It's hard not to follow that script, that program. It's hard not to be, it's hard not to kind of outsource a lot of our identity to that robot programming that you described, because it's what's expected. And yet, when we come together, and it's, Jacob, you're the one who brings in the Lord of the Rings imagery so beautifully. In the word fellowship is in our document, I think, the launch document, but it's your word. When we come together in a fellowship where we realize we're all in search of that themos, but in the way, OG, that you described, not in a power over way, but in a kind of competition with ourself way, then things start to open up, and there's a kind of exhale in the system, a relaxation, and not a relaxation as in relaxing and kind of letting the challenge go, but feeling more confident or more supported to engage with life, by acknowledging that there is that ring to grasp for, in a way. Yeah. Oh, and one final thing that came to me, I must share, the preparedness. Well, I love that distinction around preparation versus planning. And it came to me as you were talking, presence is preparation. Being present, really having presence is a form of preparation, because when we're present, we can act spontaneously, fluidly. We can move with life as it wants to unfold, rather than trying to control it and getting disappointed when it doesn't do what we tell it. Yeah, so maybe presence is a big part of preparation. Thank you.
Yeah, really, really, really well put, guys. I feel myself in the midst of it now. And yeah, I mean, philosophy as a form of that kind of preparation, and then philosophy in that other meaning of it that John Vervaeke's been so vocal of, as love of wisdom. And we talk about wisdom fields and wisdom as something that, you don't just kind of receive on high from an authority or a book, but something that you participate in. It's a quality of attunement and presence to the present moment, to your participation with others, in which you've reached a place of where mutual transformation is possible. And I think this is what the old initiatory rites and the old intergenerational transmission was really about. Some of it was, don't go and play around in that river because you'll die, it's dangerous, etc. But a lot of it is actually just being with other men. And so much of our kind of deep code, our deep humanity learns through being with others who are really being themselves. And so it follows then that it's really important we create spaces oriented towards people being and becoming more of themselves. And so having that sort of horizon of uncertainty is really, really essential and a core piece of Dialogos, a core piece of what we're bringing into the Resonant Man, is that you're getting better and better and better at being intimate with the uncertainty, intimate with the unfoldment, and therefore, at some point after participating in that field, you're going to encounter a moment that you didn't plan for, but you're now better prepared for. And there's a possibility of an action, and maybe it's a courageous action, maybe there's some thymos involved, but you have the kind of courage to stand on the precipice of uncertainty and make a new move. And I think it's really well observed that a lot of that that deep socialization, that deep kind of context of becoming into life, being seen, being known, has been outsourced to corporations and corporate contexts, which have a lot of incentives that aren't really interested in our becoming who we are. They're interested in us becoming who fits well in that machine. And there's all kinds of problems coming out of that. In addition to which, we have a fully integrated work environment, which, I think Mathew and I probably agree there's something really important about that development. We're not trying to turn back the wheels on the transformations that have happened in the last century. But we recognize somewhere inside ourselves when we listen quietly that there is something, there's a pulse, and there's a pulse that we can really tune into in the company of other men. And that's really important.
No, everything that's been said is tremendous.
A way I think about it is generally there are two ways you get ready for the future. And there's something about the masculine that is associated with the future, thinking about the future, that provide building things, there's a kind of future orientation, of which then is, of course, automatically a big problem, because we've been saying that there's something about being present that is necessary. So how do you be present in a way that's open to the future without losing yourself in the future? Oh, man. And this is part of the issue, too. There's something about an art of paradoxical needs or invitations. There's something paradoxical that's not the same as a contradiction, but a kind of bothness that automatically speaks to masculinity having something to do with art, because arts tend to be in the business of paradox, whereas thought and science is in the business of syllogism. And a paradox is where you have to do two things at once that can kind of conflict with one another. And yet a paradox is something you hold from becoming a contradiction, which is you learned about how to be present now and present in such a manner that you're ready for the future without losing yourself in the future. Well, that sounds like you've got two chemicals that if they touch, they blow up. Yes, you do. And you have to hold them together without them blowing up. So this, in masculinity, is a lot about that. Masculinity, in this framing, is about holding chemicals, two things at once that if they touch, blow up, and yet you can't put them down. And the temptation is to put one of them down. Well, I won't think about the future at all because I'm just going to be present. Well, then it's empty. And it's kind of, it could be pleasure hungry or not even thinking about the future. But then you're like, well, I'm going to think about the future and not think about the present at all. Well, now you're not intimate. You're probably planning for the future at the expense of the present. And there's all sorts of pathology you fall into. So you have to do a bothness, which by definition is risky. But that's why it could be thematic. You're not going to find the thematic where you don't find the risk, right? So you have to hold these things. But anyway, I think there are generally two ways you'd be ready for the future. One, you plan to make sure that no bad things happen. Or two, you're prepared for any bad thing that does happen so that you're able to address it. The modern world is all in the business of planning to make sure nothing bad happens. And you as a man are made to feel responsible and a good man to the degree that you plan to make sure nothing bad happens. But that means you're a technocrat. That means you're a system builder. That means you're all about like thinking of the future and following in line with what the system has at play, right? There's a massive risk here. But if instead you focus on being prepared for any bad things that may happen so that you're able to address them, well, that's outside of delusion capture. That's outside the system. And it has a lot more to do with thinking the unknown. Well, how do you think the unknown? Not easily. Sounds like a challenge, which is exactly what the man's looking for. You're exactly looking for something thymotic, right? Like, what does it look like to be prepared for the future versus to plan for the future? Well, for example, this manifests quite practically. There's a lot of people, for example, who learn how to perhaps put money in a Roth IRA. They learn to cut their spending to make sure that they've got money in the bank account and they're prepared for a rainy day. And very often as a man, when you grow up, you're heard you need to be, you need to do stuff like that. Save your money, be prepared for rainy days, save for retirement, etc., so forth. Now, I'm not telling you that's bad advice. I'm not telling you that's not good, but that's very different advice from learn how to invest, learn to identify a cost-benefit analysis that makes this a good risk to take, learn how to have many abilities so that if you lose your job, you don't go under because you're able to pivot. Have the ability to pivot because you have enough skills that you're not captured by that corporation, because if they start taking advantage of you, you're stuck unless you know how to do things outside the corporation, right? Notice that you can do both. This is another first things first. You can, if you prepare, you can also plan, but if you plan, you're probably going to be habituated out of preparing because planning makes you comfortable. And comfort is dangerous because comfort gets you into habits of not having to actively push yourself into new directions, right? But if instead you go, no, I'm going to learn to invest. And let me tell you, and again, I'm not telling everyone to go jump on GameStop right now or anything like that, but there is something to be said about learning how to say, I believe that this company has value and I'm going to invest in it, and watch yourself lose $500. That's pretty painful, but actually that's really good for you. Because if you're able to do it, say, no, I did the work, I did the research, I trust in this investment. There is something about that is very different than putting money in a bank and just getting your, I guess, 0.001% at this point, but whatever it is, there's no risk there, right? So both of them involve money, but they train the subject differently. They train the person differently. And you see, what I would say is we need to think about life as there are different ways to be ready for the future. And very often, the very principles and values of the society push you into readiness for the future in a manner that makes you avoid bad things versus be able to handle whatever is thrown at you because you're able to take it. Nassim Taleb talks about anti-fragility, right? There's something about the anti-fragile that is very thematic and very necessary, but this isn't what you learn in school. You're basically taught to be comfortable. Here's the problem with comfort, of course. I do not think the comfort addresses the thematic. It actually, like you were saying, Mr. Gray, it leaves this thematic unaddressed. I think a lot of the pathologies and toxicity you're seeing in masculinity is a result of a society that has trained men to associate the responsible way of life, to go down a path of planning and comfort and the expected, which they are told is responsible, that then leads to certain things unaddressed, that then also makes them feel trapped and whatever job or corporation they have because they have no skills outside of it. And then they find themselves not even knowing that an option of a different way of life is available to them, but they feel it. And so all they can do is lash out or descend into nihilism, descend into a certain hopelessness. So I think this conversation on the thematic and the masculine also has a lot to do with hope. And a people without hope can die. They can feel trapped. And when people are trapped, they tend to respond in very, very problematic ways. And then I'll pass it on. In a world where we're only able to think comfort, as opposed to victory that is a result of rising to a challenge, there's a difference between comfort and victory, if you will. There's a difference between a world in which everything is good and a world that is a kind of peace that is the result of a battle. You know, when you look back in the thematic, there's a notion of the peace that is a result of returning to Ithaca, returning to coming home. That's very different. Peace and comfort are actually quite different. Peace, in this sense, is only a product of the thematic. Comfort can be a result of avoiding the thematic, and that means there's a pathology under the surface that could explode out. And so if we realize that difference, then we also realize that we have to figure out how to do things differently, not to fall into that trap, because right now we seem to be choosing either between an explosion of everyone really upset or like the rat utopia, right? The rat utopia experiment where the mice are all comfortable and everything's great and they all start eating themselves and it all collapses. The Cahoon experiment that Samuel Barnes and Raymond were talking about. Comfort does not necessarily mean you live a good world. It could mean that the society eats itself. But then in response to that comfort, it doesn't seem to be the answer to go into these various pathologies. So we need to figure out what it would mean to live lives that are thymotic and can arise to the occasions of peace. But that's going to require a different assortment of values, where right now our value is to make sure nothing bad happens, as opposed to our values being we are the kind of subjects that are ready for whatever bad happens, so that actually we address it, and then we're able to tell a great story about it later on because we're able to rise over the victory. The Lord of the Rings would not have been much fun if they would have made sure that nothing bad happened, as opposed to Frodo and everyone able to rise to the occasion of Sauron once he appeared.
Yeah, wonderfully put, Daniel. I just appreciate the really strong through line of the necessity of courage that comes through in your vision for this. Mathew, I'm really interested. Part of what was coming up for me there was a sense of like, how does what you focused on in relation to healing and healing the past, how does that actually help us to be better prepared for the future? And, you know, feel free to take this wherever you feel called. And then I'm also interested, Daniel, potentially to consider a little bit of the kind of Christ element of this, especially in the context of the real revival in Christianity going on right now. Like how does that inform masculinity as well? So Mathew, please.
Yeah, I feel so much recognition of what you both have been describing, these modern dilemmas. And I've lived both. I've been in the company, in the big corporations, and done okay in that world, but also recognized that I couldn't stay in those environments. The compromises that I was having to make, the behaviors that I was having to endorse, the whole system that I was actually serving, it was corroding my soul. And I remember a few years ago having a full body realization in an instant, I can't stay in this place. I have to leave. And I had to I left. I was fortunate to find a good job, but I took a big pay cut. I'm not on the program for planning in the way that I assumed I would be at this age. I can guarantee you that. And there's some anxiety there. And I think I'm less anxious about that. And this conversation has actually provided a way of thinking about that challenge, which I find really valuable. But yeah, at 2 a.m. sometimes I think, wow, what am I doing? But I know that if I'd stayed in that system, I certainly wouldn't be having this conversation. There'd be no resonant man. And who would I be? I'd be a different person. There's a thymotic move in leaving that world. So that was really that really gave me a framework for thinking about my recent experience that is actually really, really valuable. In terms of the healing question, what's coming up for me is the observation, and maybe for many people a reminder, that when we heal or we integrate trauma, whether that's our individual trauma from our own biography, whether it's a piece of the collective cultural trauma that we're carrying as a result of being in the cultures that we're in, or transgenerational family trauma, wherever that fragment comes from, integrating that in an embodied way, harvesting the wisdom that was frozen in that trapped energy, turns us into a different person. We are different through the healing. We are expanded. We're stretched bigger. We have a broader view. We have a deeper capacity to relate. It's not, I think sometimes in the kind of conversation around healing, people think of it, oh, is something bad as I've got to get rid of. It's like there's a problem I need to fix, or there's something that's wrong with me that if I'm better, I'll be okay. No, it's not like that. And a lot of what I've been learning about healing is that it's about how we're hosting the bad things, hosting them in our system. It's not necessarily that we're going to get rid of them, but we have a lot more choice about how we host what's painful. And that's a powerful move. But yeah, it's about becoming somebody new. And actually, I would again argue, so closer to who we really are. It's the trauma that separates us from that, our essence, from our soul, you might say. And the more we move into that safely together and bring that traumatic material into relation, the more we can download more of ourselves, maybe for want of a better image, but that's what it feels like sometimes. There's more of me present now than there was when I was still carrying a lot of that untended wounding that we all have.
It strikes me that there's a paradox there as well, in the sense that kind of becoming more of me, becoming more connected with myself, is also becoming more connected with the world. In a spiritual sense, you know, I'm less separate from the whole. I'm less separate from God or spirit. And so becoming more of me is becoming more of full participation with life. And what was coming up for me as I was listening, Matthew, is like the context of leadership in our societies, the context of leadership that's modeled to us in political leadership, for example, or in corporate leadership, you might say, is one that's not, for the most part, expressing that wholeness or connection. It's coming from a place of separation. It's leading from separation. And this is affecting our decision making. It's affecting our capacity to have the kind of reverence for life, reverence for the natural world, that allows us to kind of move forward. Well, it's contributing to a climate of polarization. And somewhere in the midst of that sort of landscape of fragmentation, the resonant man comes through with this possibility. And that possibility is actually something that's been born out through those experiences of healing that Matthew's describing, like, and, you know, often they are pretty powerful. Like, the things that kind of connected me and Mathew in the first place was, you know, experiences of healing wounds that we didn't even know we had from our ancestors in war. And healing something like that is not something that's done through just ordinary talk therapy kind of paradigm. Often it is like really just opening up to like, wow, something really wants to happen. There's a release that wants to happen. And being able to like know when is that moment that I need to kind of tune into that impulse and let this thing come through, let this thing move. And as you say, when we do that, we've kind of expanded our body of awareness. So we can be more considerate of the whole of the situation. We can be more sensitive to everything that's going on. We can be in the conflict with our marital partner and completely wrapped up in it, but also have that extra awareness. It's like, oh, I'm just catching myself in the pattern right now. Or I've caught the pattern in you, and I'm able to actually communicate this in a way that opens it up rather than just like destroys it or locks us into the same confrontation. So I think the Resonant Man is also about a wholesome quality of leadership. We talk about leading from the center, leading from an awareness of the whole of the field, and leading from the heart rather than a rigidity of mind.
Wonderful. When you mention healing, I think it was Susan Sontag on her book, Metaphor is Illness, Illness is Metaphor, where she really warns that metaphors are not merely decorations of thought, but they're very framings of thought, and they often frame our thinking and we don't even realize it. And I think the problem is today, we basically approach healing from a pill metaphor. Healing is something you take a pill and it's done with, and that's the metaphor by which we think of all healing. But when you go back, healing required a journey, it required a process, it required work, and I like that phrase you just used of catching the pattern. That's quite lovely. And that is very thematic. You're discerning, you're wise, there's a prepared, I'm prepared to catch that. I'm prepared to catch that pattern. I'm prepared to go on the journey of healing, right? Basically now, because we think about healing pharmaceutically, then there's a plan. I'm sick, plan, go to CVS, get pill, done. And if you don't do that, you're stubborn and irrational. This is also part of the problem. Basically, if you engage in any forms of healing outside the pharmaceutical or expert class, going to the therapist, going to an expert, you're stubborn. You're irrational. You're dumb. You see how it works. And I would argue that basically the type of healing that you're describing, which I would associate with the journey or the work, these are thematic. They're masculine, and they're not allowed under the metaphor of the pill of the pharmaceutical that disables us from participating in these processes. You know, Ivan Illich talks about the age of disablement. And I really think what he's getting at can't be overlooked. And what he warns is that in the world of experts, if you, the phrase he uses in his book on the rights to useful unemployment, he says, if you build your own house, you are seen as a deviant because you could have gotten an expert to do it and you did it yourself. Well, you're just stubborn then. We don't view it as an incredible accomplishment or an art form. We think you're being irresponsible, right? So what ends up happening is any skill that you could develop to do something for yourself is seen as a certain deviance and madness, and you're supposed to refer to the expert class and get them to do it for you. Which one means you need to make a lot of money, which probably means you're in one of those office jobs that's not demotic. Second, you feel disabled. You as a man feel like you can't build your own house. But if you go to learn it on your own, oh, that's cute. That's a hobby. And you're not spending time with your family, so you're stubborn and self-centered. You see how it all feeds, right? So there's an ethic of disablement based on the existence of an expert class. And here's the trick. Whatever metaphoric structure or logic the expert class uses, that is what's going to spread. And so if the expert class has a pharmaceutical metaphor, the only way we can think about healing is not as doing some work to find ancestral wounds, not as a process of coming to terms with yourself. No, you just need to sign for the process. You know, your session is at 2:30. It's between 2:30 and 3. And if you do that every week for a few weeks, you'll be better. And here's some medication. Again, all of those can have a role. All of those can have a place. But the issue is, the more we are bound to think only one way because of a mono metaphor, a single metaphor that dominates the discourse, the higher the probability we will be inefficient or wrongly applying because we will only have one tool in the toolbox. And when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if there are certain forms of healing that require the kind of process that you are describing, or various thymotic practices, then these can never heal in a society that is under the tyranny of a pill metaphor. And then we are stuck then with a wound that we can never heal. And then if we talk about it, you're talking about something irrational. And so you repress and you stuff it. And you don't talk about these wounds that you feel that you can't find a pill for, but you're not allowed to say you can't find a pill for because they're not supposed to exist. And people are going to accuse you of being weak or being, thinking about something you shouldn't. So you repress, you repress, you repress. And one day, what does it do? Blow up. And then you get all of these problematic pathologies that are developing, or these men that just don't talk. Why is it, there's this issue where men, for example, are said they don't talk about feelings or they don't talk about what they're going for? Well, because talking about these things, it's very difficult to talk about one thing. When you start talking about your life, you tend to talk about your life. They all start to come up. Like, it's very difficult to pull up one root of a plant without pulling up all the roots of the plant, right? So then all of these things come up, but the society doesn't give you any metaphors or any structures by which to deal with the rest of the roots that come up. So it doesn't go well. So you stuff them back underground and you never try to pull them out again. Because when you did, it didn't go well. Of course it didn't, because the society doesn't provide any resources for it, and you don't even have the metaphoric structure to think about that as a wound that cannot be addressed with a pill, because in your world that is metaphorically framed, the only wounds that exist are ones that can be treated by a pill. So then this wound that you find yourself with is an anomaly that you can't even understand, so you try to ignore it. But as you ignore it, it only grows and gets worse, and so you end up being, well, nihilistic or repressed or pathological, or all these other forms that develop. So I think opening the avenues of healing to have different metaphors by which there is some healing that requires a path. There is some healing that requires lifting a weight. There is some healing that requires giving a gift. There is some healing that requires taking a pill. There is some healing that requires you to avoid getting out of the desert and finding an oasis. There are different forms of healing that under a disabling expert class, you are disabled from thinking. And so we have to recover these different ways of thinking if we are going to heal. And basically, when we talk about masculinity, we can't recover that without healing, because any masculinity you bring to the fore will be what? Wounded. And if it's wounded, it's probably not going to gift. It's hard to give gifts when you're wounded, right? It's hard to give gifts when you're incapable of healing, because you can't, like, you're looking for help. You're like, help. That's not a gift. You're looking for help. And then people are like, what the heck is wrong with you? And then conflict, right? And also that healing has to take place in order to then be a healer in a community, to be in a community to also provide healing, right? Which is then thymotic and gifting as well. So I just, before getting on Jesus, I just wanted to comment on all those healing, but let me pass it on for a moment, because I just think the topic of healing is so big.
I just wanted to briefly interject there, Daniel, because I find that to be really deeply moving. Like what you're talking about, I can feel the reality of that in my own ancestry. Like I can see my father and I can see my grandfather, and I can see them receiving these, solutions, receiving antidepressants, receiving these things that never really get down to the roots. And I can see the way that English culture and society in particular, like, has left men abandoned on islands of their own feelings and their own psyches, and left without a space to, as you say, draw up the roots and be free to associate and see where it goes. And if there's anger, there's anger. And if there's tears, along with all of the resources that you described, like picking up the weight. Maybe weights training is important to emotional healing. Maybe actually drawing up these spiritual resources that are deep in our culture, these aspects of Christianity and potentially other traditions that are about taking up the cross and like the valor and value of moving with that. And so, yeah, I just wanted to recognize what you're saying is rippling into my world, and it feels deeply true, and it's so core to this moment. And it's so beautiful that Matthew and I are two different generations, but participating both in the intergenerational process. And I don't know what comes up for you, Matthew. I mean, you talked about your dad or granddad being in the shed for most of his life, and I know that's part of the English tradition in general.
Yeah, I mean, what I learned recently, well, I would say as a result of the men's work I was doing in the Thomas Hubel field, my relationship with my father has really shifted. And there's a couple of layers to that. One of them was that I realized I was often angry with my father because I felt like he didn't trust me at some level. And it would come out in petty ways over small things. But I realized I need to be trusted by my father. And actually, there was a moment where I was able to say to him, I feel like you don't trust me. And even as I remember it now, it's very, very tender in me. And as I spoke to him, the feeling, the rawness of that really rushed to the surface. And he could see it took us out of a habitual relation. He was able to see my emotion or my truth in those words, and it touched him in a way that I don't think anything I've said has touched him in 48 years probably. And we had a little hug. I mean, that's pretty radical for my dad and me. And there was something in that moment that was healed in me, because I realized that it wasn't his fault, actually, that he didn't trust me. And it was okay that he didn't trust me. And actually, it was his wound that he wasn't able to trust me in the way that I felt I needed. And I later learned, as again, part of this work surfacing, like one of the things I love about what I've learned in this healing work in the last few years is that we can have a process and wow, tears and energy and wow, something's happened. But then information surfaces in the days and weeks afterwards as part of that process, that we have to be very alert and prepared and present for that information to arrive. And one of the pieces of information that I hadn't been aware of was that in my grandfather, I knew he'd been in the First World War and had a terrible time in the Depression and the Second World War. He'd married my grandmother and they never spoke. My dad said he grew up in a house where his mother and father did not speak, and they almost never went out as a family. They never virtually didn't speak to him, and they had no friends. And I thought, wow, and I never really understood the depth of that context that he grew up in. And it made a lot more sense of what I saw as some of the deficits maybe. And that I received. But what the beauty of this work is that we can work backwards. The ancestral channels can open, and we can think about retro causation and sending healing back through the generations. And I feel very, very confident now that something in our whole system has shifted as a result of this work. And I recognized I was carrying a lot of my granddad's anger. And actually I've managed to wash some of that through my system now. So yeah, there's a beauty in that. And it's when we create the field, as we will with the Resonant Man, the intelligence starts to allow this work to happen if we just stay patient and present and make ourselves available to it. Yeah, there's a real beauty in that.
Well, I'll just comment, in that story, and that was beautiful, Matthew. It makes me think of the importance of being able to interpret pain as a signal to seek a story versus a pill. You feel a pain. And I think part of the issue today, because I meant to say, I think we only know, under the metaphor of the pill or the pharmaceutical metaphor, the only way we can interpret pain as I need to go find a pill, basically, to feel better. Or maybe some fast food or a movie or some sort of dopamine thing, right? Those are forms of pills that we seek when we have pain, right? It's not in our consciousness to say pain is a signal, not something to get rid of. The pain is there. That means I need to do something, not try to get rid of it. Like I always think, like Marcel always talks about, if something hurts in your body, don't necessarily interpret as meaning your body is broke. Maybe the pain and the fever are a sign of health. Maybe you have a fever because the body's trying to heal. Maybe that pain is evidence that you need to do something different, right? Not just say, if your back hurts, maybe you shouldn't sit at your computer all day. Maybe you need a standing table, right? Don't say, well, I need a surgery. Well, I need to take some pills so I don't have. No, you need to do something different. And seeing pain as an invitation to a response versus trying to get rid of it is, I actually think, extremely important. Because I think the majority of pain actually is often things we need to respond to, not try to get rid of. Well, responding to is very thematic. Responding to is very masculine as opposed to an expert class or different things, right? Now, again, you want there to be an expert class because if, you get in a car wreck and you need a surgery, you want there to be experts to give you a surgery. So again, you want to have that tool in the toolbox. But the problem is we only have one way today to interpret pain. We only have one way to interpret difficulty. And the problem is, the other thing, if you say, maybe pain, and for me, I think this is very important what you're getting at, I find often that pain in a relationship is evidence of a need to find a context. It is not the need of a fight or to make the person apologize or make the person, and yeah, there is a kind of apology, but again, it's the first or second thing first. There's usually a story that needs to be found. And you could say the masculine response to pain in a relationship is not power dominance and get the person to see that they're wronged, but to actually be brave enough to go look for the context, brave enough to search for the story, to have the patience to sit there to work through the emotions as the story comes out, to listen, not to tell the person what they should do. There is something incredibly masculine in this waiting, in this listening, because it is really hard to go through somebody's story and to hear the pain, and maybe they react here and there, and maybe they get emotional, and you're able to be there present with it. And this would also be an example where being present is really good for the future, because if you can find the story in that immediate relationship, that's going to change how the future unfolds with that person, right? And so learning how to be present with the person so that the context emerges has massive future ramifications, precisely because you're not thinking about the future, you're thinking about them. You're thinking about finding the context and story with them. And that's why the future can be different and can unfold in a different way. But we have to be able to see pain as a signal that a story needs to be found, or pain as a signal that something needs to be changed. Not that you need to get rid of the pain. The pain can be evident. Pain can be a healthy signal. It can be a guide to health if you know how to respond to it. But again, if we've all been trapped in a pharmaceutical metaphor, then we can't interpret that pain. We can only interpret pain as evidence to go to the expert class, to that of which is a testament to our disablement. Here's the problem as well. That means the only way to get healing is to actually participate in that of which reifies your disablement. So of course then we don't feel thymotic. Of course then we don't feel capable, because every way that we address a problem is that of which is a testament to our inability. And so then of course you feel like something is wrong. Well, yes, you're incapable. And I think that, just as a little note, does kind of to me speak to Jesus, because what's always wild to me about Jesus is no matter what people throw at him, he seems ready for it, right? He always has an answer. Some sick person comes up, he can heal them. Like, Jesus is a hip hop improvisation master, really. Like, whatever occurs, he's ready for. And I think what's interesting is Jesus is also a carpenter, which is remarkably difficult back in that day and age, required incredible physical strength and capacity. But Jesus isn't telling you all the time, look at my biceps, look how strong I am, or different stuff like that. In fact, he's kind of low key. But in that low keyness, it's actually evidence of confidence. This is the key. A confident man doesn't have to tell you all the time how great he is. A confident man can just show it when the occasion arises. And I think you see that in Jesus. He can just show his wisdom when the occasion arises. He can just show his ability to be there for people when it arises. He can just show that he's able to, in fact, do these different tasks that need to occur when it happens. And I think this also, and before I keep going, I'll pass it on, because this also makes me think of the problem is we've lost the mid-years in masculinity. So basically you have to be a success by the time you're 29 or you're a great failure. There's no developmentalism. Therefore, you can't have any movement into eldership, and we become pathological. But before I touch on all of that, to finish what we're saying about Jesus, but the problem of the loss of the mid-years cannot be overstated. What you see in Jesus is a confidence. As a note, The problem is we associate masculinity with actually in the mind and in life with certainty, not confidence. Leslie Newbegin has a lovely book called Proper Confidence, where he says the road to nihilism is the quest for certainty, because certainty doesn't exist. And so if you're trying to get certainty, starting with Descartes, he places it at Descartes as the beginning of the quest for certainty, right? Well, certainty means that you know everything that's going to happen, right? Like you are certain of the future, you're certain of what to believe, you're certain of what to do. Well, that means you can't entertain ideas. You have to be certain of ideas. That means you need power and control to be certain of the future. That means you have to keep out otherness and difference so you can maintain your certainty. And that means you also want to have access to the expert class to be certain that when you feel pain, you have a pill, etc., so forth. Leslie Newbegin says that the philosophical value, theological value, practical value of certainty is what has led to nihilism and basically the destruction of the world. To be really dramatic. He said certainty is really bad. But just because you can't have certainty doesn't mean that you're stuck in nihilism or nothing is true. He says, no. You can have plenty of confidence. I can't be certain that when I drop a pen for the 500th time, it's going to fall, but I can be real confident of it. And in fact, my confidence is a testament to the test and experience and the work I did to earn that confidence. Likewise, what you see in Jesus is not certainty. You have confidence that the Father is good, but clearly on the cross, he's like, my God, why'd you do this? But he's confident because he saw it through, right? He's confident that he's going to be able to respond to what people throw at him. He's confident that he's going to be able to be there for what occurs. And this is for some forms of anti-fragility. This is actually to be ready for what life throws at us. And you see, what we have to do is, I think when we think about faith, and I think my internet has frozen and hopefully will come back in a minute, but I'll keep talking in case it works. There it goes. I saw the freeze. I'm sorry about that, but I'll keep. So in Jesus, you see confidence. He doesn't need certainty. He knows that the Father's will is good. He doesn't know who's going to come ask for healing, but he's confident in it, right? Likewise, what the masculinity is not about certainty of the future or certainty of what's going to happen. It's confidence that you're able to handle, again, whatever is thrown out at you. And that confidence is then thymotic, right? And that's what I think you see in Jesus. I think you see a commitment and then a confidence in himself to be able to realize that commitment. And I think that's how we have to think as well. Because here's the problem. All of the talk about masculinity, if you pair it up with a value of certainty, then you have to live your life to make sure that you have certainty. But that means you have to avoid, that means it's going to be power over life, over others. And you're not going to enter any journey because journeys are risky and can destroy your certainty, right? But if instead it is about confidence, well, what does confidence do? People, when someone walks in a room who has confidence, isn't it kind of inspiring? Because confidence is not egotism. Those get conflated. We think that an egotist is confident. No, egotists aren't confident at all. They're pathological. They're constantly hiding their insecurity. Confidence is seen in that individual who doesn't think about themselves because they don't have to worry about themselves because they know they have what it takes for whatever the world throws at them. You only think about yourself when you're not confident that you can handle what's going to be thrown at you, right? You enter into what Timothy Keller called self-forgetfulness when you're confident, right? The confident person is entirely other-focused because they don't have to think about themselves because they took care of it, so now they can think about you. Now they can
Perfect freeze.
Yeah.
focus on you. Now they can focus on what's outside of them, right? And so that's the main value. Certainty, I keep going in and out. I'm so sorry. Under modernity, certainty has become the kind of virtue which everyone is seeking. Whereas confidence, because certainty, by definition, requires you to power over the other to make sure they don't destroy your certainty. Whereas confidence means you can be other focused because you've taken care of yourself, so now you can focus on them. But to get that kind of confidence means you have to treat pain as a signal, do the work of healing so that you have that confidence. Because when you've done the work of healing, then you can have confidence in yourself not to worry about wounds. Because if I do get wounded in this relationship, I have confidence in myself to be able to go through the work because I've done it before, because I have done it and I can do it again and again and again. So I don't need to shield myself off from the other. In fact, I can go and enter into the space of the other. But I think generally, and then I'll pass it on, and there's more to say on Jesus. But it's what you see is, I think it is very difficult to think about masculinity in a world where the prime virtue is either certainty or nihilism, when those aren't the only two options. Confidence is actually what it is about. Philosophy is to be in service of attaining confidence. Life planning is about confidence, not certainty, because if you're trying to get certainty, you're making yourself into a computer. And if the only other option is nihilism, then it's either AI or the void. And I think we can choose something between those two that is more like Jesus, that is a expression and showing of confidence. And I think, to me, when I think the Resident Man, I think that's part of it.
Matthew, there's so much to say, but I want to hand it to you.
Yeah, I love that distinction: confidence and versus certainty, preparedness, preparation versus planning, like beautiful axis to sit on. I'm still sitting with what Daniel said about story and the need for story, and story's relationship with healing. And I'm thinking of something quite painful in my life, my own life, which I realize doesn't have there's no story. I can't explain it, and it hasn't resolved in me. And it's I think a large part of that is because there's no story. And the challenge, I suppose, we have when we don't have a story is that we can't tell our story because we don't know what our story is. And it's very difficult to begin a conversation with someone when you don't have, or at least you need a certain kind of space to begin a conversation where you don't know what your story is. Usually it's the other way around. We're imposing our stories on each other. And I love what you said, Daniel, as well, about the confidence not needing something from another person in a way that we actually, and I was hearing it as, we can serve another person. We're not looking for our reference point from someone else, but we can offer service. I'm a fan of Caroline Meese, and what did she say? I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here to help you understand your life better. And I'm somebody who has struggled a lot with feeling like I'm falling behind my peers, or that I'm not quite making it in some way, or that I'm not thymotic enough. I can recognize that struggle in me. But I love that idea that, I'm not competing with you, but I'm here to help you understand your life better. And I think that's kind of, it may not be our official motto, but that's a spirit that I feel infused in our initiative. Jacob, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, no, there's something about this that kind of strikes a resonant, like hitting a bowl or a gong or something, like what you've said, but particularly on story. From a big picture perspective, we are in a time between stories collectively, and the lack of a story and the capacity to tell story is a big piece of kind of the loss of a collective space, of a common space, of a kind of sense of continuity. And what started to really arrive for me, much like, this whole project, it's not something necessarily planned ahead and done. It's more like it's coming through the more we're present to it, is that these spaces of dialogos, these spaces of deep listening, are precisely the spaces where new stories can begin to grow, new stories can come forth. And so there's a kind of art and a midwifery of holding the space in which a story that has never come to pass, has never come to form, can begin to come through. And yeah, I really resonate with that description, Matthew. Like I can also feel that about myself. Like there's parts of my life, there's parts of like, I don't like, I meet people who really can tell the story of their childhood, or they can tell the story of what have you. And for me, it's more like memories here, patches here, but I don't have that. And so in order to actually tell that, I do have to go to an edge. And, you know, in another men's context, with Jordan Bates's circle, we've been doing, you know, inner child exploration exercises and kind of like telling the story of, you know, speaking from our inner child and all this stuff. And it's fascinating because all these different modalities can help us to kind of forge these winding paths back through ourselves and join memories together and weave our biographies together in a way that, like, the story of who we are, the story of our lives, the story of what this is about becomes more coherent. And in that, I think we become more of who we are, and we become more readily available to the moment. And I think what comes through for me in relation to, like, perhaps the big connection between what you've said about, you know, the model of Jesus and healing as a kind of new science that Matthew's been studying, is that we have a faith in this process and we're serving it. Ultimately, we're not acting from our own power. We're not, I have the power and I will lay my hand on you and blah, 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 you know, you'll be healed. It's, we're in the service of the spirit of healing when we're really tuning in, when we're really listening with our full heart, you know, when we're connecting with that field, with that collective consciousness. It has the wisdom, it has the knowledge of what's needed. And I think what you describe in your story with your dad, and what I've witnessed so many times, is that there are these moments that you could never ever predict, you could never ever plan. And it's precisely in those moments that something new, something that's never occurred before can come through, and it can be profoundly healing, and it can be a profound realization. And so we're humbly witnessing that and wanting to create a space where more of that can occur. And it's not about knowing what it's going to be, it's about creating the conditions and inviting that spirit and that space of possibility to show up. And we don't know what it's going to be, much like this conversation. None of us have come in with a plan for it. We're just letting the moment show us what's needed and try and be as true and forthright and you know, show up in that fellowship of the ring spirit to what the moment demands of us.
And the practices help us to be prepared. We're cultivating the preparedness for those moments, because the moment I described with my father couldn't have happened if I hadn't been prepared and I hadn't been working on myself. It didn't just happen. It happened because I was able to respond differently to my trigger. I was able to be in a space with my dad in a different way. I was able to have a confidence about letting the process unfold and not knowing what would come up for me or in him. And those were skills that I built in fellowship with other men and the wider field, with more women in the field, in our field, than men, but there's a lot of men. But that's, I think, exactly what allows us to access more of those moments, to or at least invite the grace. We don't control grace, obviously, but we can at least be available to the possibility of grace.
Magnificent. And
I'm sorry about the internet being silly. When it gets hazy and it rains, it might do that on my end, but I really like everything that's being said. I think there is a the relationship of pain, story, meaning, thymos, all of these things, I think, is pretty profound. And I think some of the best resources on it can be found in some of sort of the mystics. I think of a Saint Neville, John of the Cross, or different things. And or we even, you know, Paul, because I'll just mention Christianity more with Jesus. And like you have this idea that in sometimes pain is a thorn that you are supposed. It's interesting, like with Saint Teresa, there's this notion that there is certain pain that you actually need or you cannot spiritually develop. So the story is you bearing it, not in your ability to bear it when you don't even know why you need to bear it. You know, so you have that. Then you have the pain that emerges that makes you angry at the other person because you actually need to tell them something or be open with them or confront them and you don't want to do it. And so there's a lack of spiritual development. And what's very interesting is that in the mystical tradition, there is some connection between pain and a lack, like the improper response to your anger. Like your anger is a signal that you need to work on yourself. Or your pain is a signal that you need to actually, leave that job that you're at because you have this mental pain. Like we don't read our body as giving us signals of things that we need to do. But it's just very interesting because in these mystical traditions, very often there's an idea that you are not going to spiritually develop. It's not going to just happen. You're just going to keep getting these signals until you do it or not. And if you don't do it, you're not going to develop. And that's that. And then that completely transforms the signals of your life from things to get rid of to things you listen to. And if you do not, then you cannot spiritually develop. And I basically think that applies to you can't develop as a man, you can't develop as a woman, you can't develop as a human being if you don't know how to respond to the signals of your being or the world. Now, this is where an entire art form can be developed because in one instance, pain means you need to find a story. In another instance, it means you need to make a choice. In another instance, it means you need to bear it in order to spiritually develop so that you respond to that pain in a manner that you're prepared for something that you don't know is going to occur, right? How do you tell the difference between these different forms of pain? How do you read those differences? Well, these aren't even things we're going to ask or think about if we're just popping a pill or trying to get rid of it, right? Like there's a difference between the Bible, for example, talks about a righteous anger, but then there's a don't be angry. Oh, well, what's the difference? What about the fear of the Lord versus do not be afraid? What's the difference between fear and anxiety? What's the difference between all of these different things? To me, when we talk about a resonant man or the ability to be a work of art, it is someone who is able to tell those differences that are something like wines that are very fine. Like, how do you tell the difference between fine wine and bad wine? I certainly can't do it. There's only one way: skill, work, experience, time, and investment, right? There are certain ways by which one can tell the difference between these emotional signals that come from a certain work. And I think basically a way to think about why masculinity seems to be in a kind of crisis is because many men cannot identify the signals that they are receiving from their masculinity to know how to respond to it. And as a result, they just do whatever they're told or that's random and it doesn't tend to work. And so I think a resource, I just think about how so much of the spiritual discipleship, the mystical discipleship are actually incredibly similar to the kind of skills and abilities to read feelings that you need to deal with something like masculinity or the resident man, or to even deal with relationships. And we simply do not have emotional intelligence. We've confused emotional intelligence with emotionalism. Emotional intelligence is a way to be a kind of movie critic of your emotions, to say, I'm feeling pain. What does that mean? What's the difference between pain that I need to bear and pain that is a signal of something broken in a relationship that I need to go into versus the pain that means I need to make a choice that I'm afraid to make? That's emotional intelligence. But we've conflated emotional intelligence with simply being someone who is able to express emotion. Now, being able to express emotion is very important. No one is saying that is bad, but it is one step on the entire art form. In order to be a painter, you need to know how to paint. But would it be the case that knowing how to paint equals being able to do the Mona Lisa? No, there are many skills that go into being a great painter or a great artist, but knowing the difference between red and blue as paints and shades of blue is an important prerequisite. Likewise, the ability to express your emotions, to sit in your emotion and dwell in your emotions is absolutely necessary for what we are talking about. But there is also a certain ability to discern shades of the signal, different meaning of these signals that is necessary so that you know how to respond. And so much, actually, of, especially in the modern world, the thematic quest is answering the responses of those signals, responding to those signals, and then doing what those signals are leading you to. If you cannot do that, it will be remarkably difficult to have that thematic address occur. But here's the problem. You're still going to be looking for the thematic. So where are you going to go and find it? Well, you're probably going to go find it in status, in dominance, in power, in control, and all of those other very problematic things that we're trying to avoid. But if instead you can respond to these signals, then there is a thematic address that is a result of going on the quest of which your very soul is sending you on, per se. And that, I think, is what we need in order to be resonant men and to be human beings that don't retreat from being human, but that rise to the occasion of its art form.
Yeah, very beautifully put, Daniel. I feel we're reaching a kind of consummation point of this dialogue. I'm feeling very connected to the spirit of the resonant man. It's feeling very philosophically infused, which is precisely, why I wanted to bring you into this, because you're so excellent at drawing out those really important distinctions. And just seeing how all of that really boils down into the fabric and substance of our lives and our core relationships and our core story, is exactly what this is about. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'll hand it to Matthew if there's any closing remarks, and then anything else that feels unsaid, Daniel, and we can close it out here.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Just feeling so much gratitude for this time, and to meet you, Daniel. It's been amazing to me to receive such a depth and breadth of distinction. Like, wow, I feel like I've had a kind of upgrade that I'll take away and process and install. Like, it's just great, beautiful, and really felt, yeah, like we started to, or how we dive deeply into a lot of the questions that are going to be emerging in our journey, in our 8-week journey, and I feel better equipped actually to go on that journey with the other men. And really excited too, Jacob, to be working with you. I was thinking earlier that you've helped me, even in the preparation for this initiative, you've helped me become clearer about my own story and what my thymos is all about. So feeling a lot of gratitude to you as well. So it's been a beautiful dialogue. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, anybody who's interested to follow through on that and participate in the initiative will be able to find the information below. And there is an early bird offer, I believe, that extends until the 19th. Is it, Matthew? Well, certainly in the next several days, there will still be an early bird offer for those who are feeling the call right now. But nonetheless, yeah, we're really excited to embark upon this. And as we've said, it's not about this initiative, although it is. It's about this field and this consciousness and this conversation that we're building and hope to continue to build with you, Daniel, in context beyond this. So thank you so much as well.
It's been a delight. I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's a treat. And Matthew, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's important work. I'm glad you're both doing it. I think there are countless people who are living with these questions, but can't even put them into words to ask the questions, let alone address them. So it is incredibly important to be formulating those things. Otherwise, it becomes impossible. I think very often we search for freedom from things, or we search for freedom to do things, kind of alluding to Isaiah Berlin. But I think the greatest freedom is found in freedom in what we have, in the life that we have, and freedom in masculinity, freedom in the world that we're in, not trying to escape to something else, not trying to get to something else. But in order to find freedom in the life that we have to be able to ask the right questions about it. We have to approach it in the right way, and we have to have the right freedom. So a course such as this provides that opportunity, and I think that is incredibly important. So I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks very much, guys.
Appreciate it.